Waiting. Okay, so we are live, and this is the final week of, well, now, in fairness, for clean architecture, there are a couple of more chapters that I'm not going to go through. Um, to some extent, they weren't particularly great, and well, and that's it. And that's it. And I'm just, one of the things that I'm finding in the later half of the book is it really started strong, but you get 80% of the value in the first half of the book. By the time you actually get into the architecture chapters, he's just really reiterating everything that you already know. And there's a lot less information that's particularly new and likely to change your working practice. So I think we're at a point where I think we can probably call this done. We're going to go through the final three chapters that I'm going to talk about, which is number 30, 31, and 32. This is a single encapsulated section called details, and I think if we look back over the course of the journey that we've had through this book, we talk about our innermost circles of our architecture, or our highest level stuff. We create them in the humble objects format. We keep them separated from everything else, and we decide that these things at the very core of our system is the stuff that really matters, the stuff that we really have to plan around. And then what we say is, don't worry about the details. And the details are the things that you can change later, or that you should defer your decision in making until as late as you possibly can. And in this respect, we've got the three chapters we're going to talk about have the titles that the database is a detail, the web is a detail, and frameworks are a detail. And we're going to go through and we're going to try and talk about what he means by that, and why we look at it like that. So in starting, we're going to look at the database as being a detail, and it's really important. Sorry, I put my keyboard down for a second so I sit back. And it's really important to understand and recognize that the shape of the data that you store, the data model itself, that's not a detail. That's actually really critically important. What fields exist on what records, what things go together. But if we go back to the history of databases, it isn't important whether your database is MySQL or a flat file or a MongoDB or Cassandra, or it's in memory, or whatever, or Postgres or SQL Server, or Oracle, any of these things, or some fancy new thing that comes out one day that does databases in an entirely new way. It's it's not important. The thing that's important is that you can store your data and you can retrieve your data. But if you think about everything that comes with a database and the way arranging things into columns and headers and tables and things like that, that's not really the core feature of what you are interested in when you are talking about individual customers, or any individual record you have, the individual products you have. We don't typically display this stuff for our applications and projects in a columnar or tabular format, right? So it's not the way that we store the data that's important. It's the data itself is important, and th- that matters. There's there's another fundamental piece that comes into play. Let's bring up the notes here so that we can have that as well. So, Oh, this doesn't have my face in it. You want my face, right? There we go. Um, Solo no. Anyways, this will be good. Nobody's actually going to be chatting, but here we go. So, oh, I know what I did wrong. Pardon me. I'm sorry. That was. There we go. Here I am. I'm right here. Okay. Um, like I promised Dave that I wouldn't waste anybody's time, but here I am wasting your time. Uh, so now here we go. So we're saying that the difference between SQL and NoSQL isn't really important. It doesn't matter. The specific underlying technology that you use for the database doesn't matter. Most of this stuff that we wound up building, I think he was saying that databases started in the 60s or 70s or whatever. They all started because we had these spinning platters for disks, and there was just value in using software to decide where things went on those little circles, and that's the way that we did it so that we could read things quickly. And so this entire paradigm was built out of our limited control of the hardware that existed at the time. One of the things I'm going to highlight this line, and hopefully, if you've gotten this far, you are aware of what CAP theorem is, but essentially we have consistency of our data, which is to say that our data is the same in every place that it's stored. There is the availability of our data where we can access it, and our servers don't get down. And then there's partitioning, which is we horizontally scale our data. And so CAP theorem says that in the existence of a partition, as soon as we have to take a single database and move it onto multiple machines, we must choose between consistency or availability of our data. We cannot have all three in one. Now, we're not here to talk about CAP theorem. It's just, you know, here it is. Let's go to this next line where we have sort of from an architectural perspective itself, it isn't really important that we think about how our data is actually physically stored, and it's not really important for for us to know what format it resides on disk, except to the extent that we can access that data and pull it into our application and use it within our business logic. Now, that's not to say that performance considerations don't come into play. If you talk to someone at, for example, Netflix, who has on the order of near, I think it is 190 million customers, you cannot store that on a single machine. You can't access that on a machine in any sort of speed. There's no machine in the world that can handle that. And so you do have to partition the data. And so you do have to find ways to do that. And to some extent, that is still not architecturally significant after you've put it behind a boundary from your application. So your application, let's talk about the place where I've done the most reading about their 100 million customers is the finance department. So their finance department has to deal with monthly billing for 190 million individuals at around like $10 to $20 a piece, right? So every month you've got to query all of these people. You've got to send all of their invoices or credit card payments or everything. You've got to deal with that. And so, so you have to find a way to be able to access that data. But once you get a single record, it's no longer important how it's stored, just that you got it. And so this piece over here becomes actually an entirely separate architecture from the business logic. And that's what we're talking about. Don't worry about the details. Keep your business logic separate and move on with your life. Now, that's, I think, that's a pretty good summary of what we come up with there. And that's it. So we're saying that the database itself is a detail, and if you're Netflix or if you're somebody with a, or Facebook has a massive database, Google has massive databases, but those are entire teams that are separate from the actual application logic layer. So let's look back the next piece. And the next piece, he says the web is a detail, and there's really not enough in that chapter to be super interested or excited about. So what we say is, just to sum it up, we say accessing on the web versus accessing within an Electron app, which is a desktop wrapper for a web page, versus a hand coded app that displays your data in sort of a GUI, a proper GUI, a non-web based GUI, or something that runs on your phone. So you're looking at iOS, or you're looking at Android, or you're looking, all of these things, these front end layers are all just details of how the information is presented that should be separate from your business logic. And to the extent that the web is just another presentation layer, the web is just an opportunity for your information to travel across a network. Um, that's just a detail. And that, again, because the web is a GUI and GUIs are graphical user interface, because a web is a GUI and GUIs are detail, the web is a detail. And so, again, you want to build a boundary between your core business logic and the presentation that you do on the web. And I think after 10 years of building web pages, I finally friggin' understand that. Like, it makes a lot of sense. You don't do your calculations on the front end. It just don't do it. Anyways, so maybe I did learn something from that chapter, but I think that came out on its own throughout the book. It was maybe I am underappreciating how valuable it was to actually state that explicitly. So here's the last one, and it's frameworks are a detail. We'll bring the notes up. So I think this is actually pretty interesting too. So frameworks are a detail, and remember again, let's restate it again. How do we separate our how do we separate our business? The most important part of our company is not how we load things. It's the logic that we apply to the thing that makes us money, or whatever. It's the framework itself is not important. But let's go back to the notes and some of these arguments that he brings out right here. And the first one is, when you are choosing a framework, say you're choosing Ruby on Rails, which is famous for being on Rails. The on Rails part is just how extremely opinionated the language framework is. You do things in the Ruby way or you can't do them. There's other, and that's, I don't actually use Ruby on Rails. Those are just the headlines from what I know about it. So somebody who does know Ruby better than me can yell at me about that if you want to. I'm paraphrasing or summarizing. There are other ones where the .NET framework versus, so there's C Sharp or .NET Core or just the libraries, but there's also the framework where if you do things in the C Sharp way or the framework way, it all works a little nicer for you. And it's a massive commitment what you choose for your project. There's Spring Boot is one of the ones in Java that you might use. So all of these things, or anything sort of an Express TypeScript, whatever. Anyways, so you have to make a massive commitment to use these things, to use frameworks, because once you write all of your systems in these frameworks, it's hard to pull them back out of your project. And something to make note of is that the framework that you make this huge commitment to does not actually make a commitment to you. They don't make promises. You look at React versus Angular versus jQuery, and new frameworks come along all the time, but you don't have a say what happens in the framework, right? So if you look at the move from Angular 1 to Angular 2, they completely rewrote all these underlying systems, and they needed to, but that was a breaking change for you. And if you had an Angular 1 project, there was a good chance you were not going to be able to move on to an Angular 2 project. Or if you look at some very early React stuff, they had these classes with component did mount and component did unmount and blah, 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 blah. And now they've moved on to React hooks where you have use effect. And anyways, I'm getting mired into the low level details of this stuff, but you don't really have a say as the project owner what the framework does. You just kind of have to use the framework that you're given in the way that it's given. Now, many frameworks ask you to inherit their code by default. So you've got to use their objects in their formats and things. And so what you have is that you except in, I think it's Angular is probably still dependency injected, but that's not really the point. The point is that mostly you're going to be violating dependency injection in the use of a framework. And your project might outgrow the framework that you choose, and you want to use a different one. So the solution we have is to, again, create a boundary, a separation layer between the framework we choose and the core business logic. Keep these things as extricated as possible so that when eventually the new framework of the day comes out, maybe everybody says, wait a second, we were wrong and jQuery is where we should be again. Maybe the people who did this separation can just rewrite their front end back into jQuery because it turns out that was the right way to do it all along. That might not happen, but one day, maybe. So what else? So yeah, let me read these notes. Say, keep the framework at arm's length, create a conversion layer to pass the information back and forth between the presentation or the framework and your, leave your business objects as plain old objects that can go anywhere, very portable. Now and it was important to note that actually, if you want to be really pedantic and you really want to pay heed to this stuff, actually, we should take note that stuff like the string libraries in Java or any file IO in Node.js these are actually also frameworks, right? So it's important when you are doing, or Express is a framework for, Express under Node is a framework for presenting web information, right? So it's really important to note that when you are using these things that are quite core to the language, and sometimes obviously you are going to use and depend on frameworks over time, the key is to make sure those choices are deliberate. Do those on purpose and don't just jump in whole hog without thinking about, do I really want to be tied to this particular piece of technology for a long period of time? And the answer is often yes. And I guess some of the things that you want to examine around decision making in terms of how deeply you can integrate with this stuff. Like, let's look at the string libraries in Java or C Sharp, anything that works with a string or date time in your favorite language. Those things are by and large, they're pretty stable, right? Now, try saying that about Angular or React. I mean, both of these things have evolved more in. Anyways, these things have, I think, annual releases or monthly releases. It's just they upgrade all the time. So I think it should be on a sliding scale based on the an inverse scale compared to their volatility as to how far you separate yourself from the framework to keep your things safe. So that's it. That's the week. That's the week. 20 minutes this time for not stopping is Dave's advice. I think was pretty good. So if I flip through, I'm just pulling up the book here, and I'll tell you, there were some parts that I thought were interesting in here that I didn't really take note of. There was this one called The Missing Chapter, where we said, where is it? This is the last we're going to talk about this, and then I'm going to shut us down. But really, so the chapter was called The Missing Chapter. Oh, that's not going to focus. Here you go. This is the conclusion of the whole book. All of this, we put 13 weeks into this, and it says, leave options open where applicable, but be pragmatic. Take into consideration the size of your team, their skill level, and the complexity of the solution in conjunction with your time and budgetary restraints. And you can see that I'm laughing because, yeah, okay. Like, that's obvious, right? I mean, 14 weeks for that? 13 weeks for that? I'm sorry. Really? You could have told me that on page. This could have been on a pamphlet. This could have been a one-page pamphlet that had that paragraph and said, use interfaces, right? Right? So that's the book. That's the book, Clean Architecture. There we go. A craftsman's guide to software structure and design. And I'll admit I liked it, and there were times that I didn't like it as much, but I'm glad we're done, and I hope you enjoyed it. And let me tell you. Okay, I know I promised I would hit pause, but actually you can also. So here, so what I'm doing now, and this is the end of the video, so there's nothing else architecture coming, so you can shut down if you want, and that's fine. But so what I'm doing now is I'm uploading the. Never mind. Nobody cares. Nobody cares. Next book, Designing Distributed Systems and Accelerate. I'm going to be doing both of these at the same time because they're both very short, and I will do. Anyways, that's it. So that's this week, and I'm going to actually record both of those first chapters in those right now, and they will be releasing sometime in the week. So bye. Oh, I wish. So I hit the stop streaming, and then it now asks me if I want to stop streaming. Yes, of course. That's why